Beautiful, thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay, it's my pleasure today to introduce Bidjut Bose. I had the pleasure of spending the night with him and eating dinner yesterday. It was really great. Bidjut came to us with a very expensive background in education in computer science, epigenetics of trauma and stress, neurobiology, and not only that, with a personal experience of incorporating meditation and yoga as a way of life. Now, having all those experiences and training and expertise, Bidjut uses all those to support children with stress and trauma. He's also the founder of Niroga Institute, which is a non-profit organization that the main purpose of this organization is to support children with chronic stress and trauma. I am very excited to listen to his talk, and it's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. And once again, if you feel like coming in close so that we're all here, especially around Q&A, it might be nice to just hang together. So a couple quick things. Yesterday, when I was having lunch with a few participants, they were saying, well, there's so much talk about all the theory and so on, but what are we to do if we've got kids, that are in serious trouble, school failure, juvenile delinquency, something practical, something concrete. And so in that spirit, this talk will give you first a short little video to see. It's going to give you a sense for our work as it plays out in the field. And so you see it's real. It's like going on a little field trip with me. And then as we talk, we will close this talk with an absolutely real bit of practice. So you get a sense for what we're talking about, a key takeaway that perhaps will come out of this. Okay? So let's just watch this little 5-6 minute video clip.
Breathe in. Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you have a question. Breathe out.
And this is the moment where the tables will turn, when the lies, the myths, and the fables will burn, and that which is pure will then shine through. So it's time to leave the negative thoughts behind you. Inhale and breathe the good air in. Exhale, release impurities within. If you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. Let's see what this new day brings.
I usually I be real nervous, my heart pound a lot, during tests. So we got 2 more weeks of testing, and yoga will take the stress away.
All right, so we're gonna all do it at the same time, and we're gonna take 5 breaths.
The rhythmic breathing really helps me. When you inhale for 4 counts and then exhale for 8, the breathing just feels really calm. So that gets me more mellow.
I'm a 12th grader, so I gotta do all my work, and I'm really stressed out because I have to graduate in a couple of weeks and I have to have everything done. You practice breathing in and out deeply, and you just clear your mind and just focus on yourself. Let all your bad thoughts pass through you. I just don't get as mad as much as I used to. I think more clearly before I act.
And bring our focus to the breath.
I remember being chased by crackheads and stuff to the store when I was little, and just getting beat up, getting in a lot of fights. I was getting fights since kindergarten. I always liked school and stuff, but then at the same time, I like doing bad stuff too, I guess, or whatever.
They come from this population from dysfunctional families. Mental and physical abuse, that kind of thing.
When I was 13, 14, that's when I started drinking heavily, because that's when I started trying to, kick it with crowds or cliques and gangs and stuff like that. I never did good in school, and I dropped out the first time when I was in the 8th grade. I just wanted to do bad things. I was just mad at the world, I guess.
With yoga, just trying to teach them that they're not captive to that, that each day is a new day, and not to let the things that have held them down for so long, just let that weight go, let it go, and just to fly forward.
This is non-trivial work. And so it's hard work, it's challenging work for a whole variety of reasons. And so we have to prepare ourselves to be able to do that and not only survive, but to thrive. And so that's a whole process that we've been developing systematically. The other piece is that what is the objective here? There's apparently 15 million or more people doing yoga, and yet all of you are certified yoga teachers. How much diversity do you see in your classes? Hardly any, right? Part of the mission is to really change the face of yoga. If it is a universal practice that means so much to you, then why aren't we seeing everyone that won't go on the cover of Vogue or Yoga Journal? That's one piece. The other piece is changing the zip code of yoga. Instead of Piedmont, instead of Palo Alto, instead of Manhattan and Martha's Vineyard, can you go out into the Iron Triangle of Richmond? Can you go out into the killer corridors of Oakland and make a difference? And that's really the challenge that's before us.
A lot of the youth in juvenile hall have extra sensory perception of what's going on outside of them because they've grown up in environments where they need that to survive. But they haven't sat quietly and looked what's going on inside of them. And so to remind them that that's the skill that they're working on and that can be a life or death skill for them.
It helps me pay attention better in class sometimes when I go back and I'm just focused. I'm trying to take my GED from me. I'm in the GED class, so if I could focus better and learn to control my thoughts and my mind and my breathing, then I could probably memorize and study better.
It's when we go inside and take that moment and find that place that we find our most generous, loving hearts. And that's where empathy comes from. All our hearts sound the same, whatever our religion, whatever our sexual orientation, whatever our accent, whatever our skin shade, our hearts sound the same. We are one family.
Have your head resting on the floor and take a big breath in.
The silence part, I like that part. Like when everybody goes into crocodile position, that's the part I like in yoga. It makes me like think what I did wrong, and then now I don't get in that much trouble anymore.
What I'm trying to get to is to get them to a place where they start to recognize when they start to feel certain emotions like anger or fear or stress, so that instead of always reacting to that emotion, they can start to understand it and then act rather than always reacting. If you can achieve that, I feel that in the future it can really help them to make better decisions.
Breathe out. Good. Shake it out.
I'm more confident for some reason. I don't know why. I'm a little more confident. I've been able to like express how I'm feeling a little more, like I'm putting more emotions in my poetry that I write. Yoga is just a great way to express anything.
Grass was greener years ago. I swear it used to grow here, but no more here.
Okay. Thank you. So at this point, over 8.5 years, Niroga Institute, this little nonprofit in the Bay Area in California, is serving a couple thousand children and teenagers, young adults all over the Bay Area in schools and alternative schools and juvenile halls and jails. Often our work revolves around kids that are coming from challenged communities at high risk of school failure and juvenile delinquency. And so let us explore this idea of learning readiness, transformative practices like you've just seen a little bit, and also talking about the context of these practices with the child who's part of a larger community. And so in that process, a quick show of hands. How many of you are pretty regularly stressed out? Okay, keep those hands up, keep those hands up. How many of you are around people, working with people, that are pretty regularly stressed out? Okay, take a quick look around the room. You see, it's about 100%. All right, relax, release. So, we know that stress is endemic in our communities. And yet, as we think about stress that's chronic or toxic, or traumatic stress, whether it's primary or secondary, whether it's post-traumatic stress, the operative word here is the pervasiveness of stress in our communities. And just as an example, I'll tell you what happened in an alternative high school in the Bay Area, where a principal said, you know, I understand the power of these practices. I'll give you an hour and a half a day, 5 days a week, and see what you can do with my kids. Perhaps taking the 15 most traumatized kids in my school. And so it was a joint program. The mental health department in the city was going to provide some cognitive behavioral therapy, complemented with transformative life skills, yoga and breathing techniques and meditation. But of course, our first challenge was, how do we find the 15 most traumatized kids in the school? And so the supervisor of mental health said, not a problem. We'll apply a standard trauma scale across the school, and then we'll choose the 15 most traumatized. And guess what? 98% of the kids in that entire school qualified to have PTSD. And even as these results popped out, the supervisor, Dr. Beam, said, BK, I'm surprised that it wasn't 100%. This is the reality of our inner city schools, where 1 in 2 are dropping out. So let's take a moment to look at the tentacles of stress and trauma. The social determinants of health, like income inequality, institutionalized racism, the breakdown of traditional family structures, we know these social determinants. And yet, every single major social determinant of health has a common effect, and that is chronic stress. Many of you are familiar with the ACE data, adverse childhood experiences. What does that show? That childhood trauma has a direct and palpable impact on chronic disease, as well as addiction, suicidal ideation, and more. There's also a dose response. The greater the ACE score, the greater the likelihood of maladaptive or self-destructive coping mechanisms. And so, with the social determinants of health and the ACE data, we're all fairly familiar with the direct health impacts of chronic stress, which is identified as a significant risk factor for most common chronic conditions, hypertension and diabetes, asthma and depression and cancer and so on. And so, as we think about stress that's completely endemic and pervasive in our communities, a question that we need to look at is, what is the impact of stress? If we look at the neuroscience research, it's basically saying there are 4 key impacts. First, attention control. Second, emotion regulation. Third, adaptive coping strategies. And fourth, empathy. This is directly from the latest neuroscience research looking at the impacts of stress, of chronic stress, on our brains. And so as you look at this, you start to see how that impacts major domains of social function. Attention control. How many times have you or people around you told you teachers, principals, we shout at our kids 100 times a day to pay attention, pay attention, pay attention, but we don't teach them how. Emotion regulation. Just think for a moment in your own lives, if there is one thing that you do that isn't affected by your ability to regulate your emotions. What you eat, how much you eat, what you read, what you watch, who you hang out with, what you discuss. And so it has a profound impact on everything we do. Look at coping strategies. Given stressful situations, we either cope or we crumble. The ability to cope is messed up with chronic stress impacting our brains. And so it's not just a matter of why can't I cope? I'm not operating from peak potential. And then empathy. The ability to feel what another is feeling. What is a family without empathy? What is a neighborhood or a community without empathy? What is a country, what is the world without empathy, where we have forgotten, where we have lost, where we have decided to not remember that we are all interconnected, that we're all interdependent. And so, in summary, stress clearly has an impact on chronic health, chronic diseases, health conditions. But the neuroscience says stress messes up our ability to regulate our emotions. And of course, then you've got impaired learning readiness. You've got connections to academic achievement, impulsive behavior, juvenile crime. And so then the question becomes, how do we heal ourselves? How do we manage our stress? And how do we heal our trauma? And so once again, you look to the neuroscience, and you find that they're identifying a class of practices that seem to mitigate every single one of those four effects. And so, what is mindfulness? Perhaps a simple definition that you are aware of what you are doing just as you are doing it, not before or after. You are aware of what you are feeling just as you're feeling it, aware of what you are thinking just as you are thinking it. What does the trauma research say? That the dorsolateral part of the prefrontal cortex doesn't even talk to the amygdala, the seat of emotion. And the prefrontal cortex, executive function, the ability to distinguish between good and bad, action and consequence. And so, given the fact that they don't even connect, the fact that we hold stress and trauma in our bodies, in our muscles, in our tissues, in our fascia, we have to move, we have to use our bodies to dissolve away the stress and to heal ourselves from the trauma. And then comes somatic psychology, which is basically saying that an optimal treatment response to trauma is an integrated approach to the way we process information, which combines the kinesthetic, the emotional, and the cognitive. Now, in terms of yoga, Raja Yoga, the science of meditation, that's a superset of all of the brands of yoga that you see in this country. What does it have to do with education? Raja Yoga is the very science of mindfulness thousands of years ago. Look at what William James, the father of Western philosophy psychology, said over 120 years ago. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. Not only that would be excellent to have in education, but look at the depth of the comment: judgment, character, and will. And what is the essence of yoga? A definition that's thrown up from over 2,000 years ago, that it is the cessation of the waves of the mind. Chitta, vritti, chitta, the mind, one aspect of the mind, the waves in the mind. What are those waves? I get mad, I get sad, I get happy, and these mental waves, a thought that bubbles up from deep down, breaks at the surface of our minds, stays for a while, and then melts away. And so what does yoga essentially do? It basically reduces the amplitude of that wave. So it doesn't go to extremes of joy and then sorrow, happiness and then unhappiness. That's inherently destabilizing. It also reduces the frequency of the wave. That you start to detect in due course, perhaps, a slowing down of that wave to the point where you might even find the little infinitesimal instants in time that are in between those waves, those moments when your mind is still enough to reflect your true nature, the infinite potential that resides within each one of us. And so, classroom climate clearly is impacted by learning readiness. Learning readiness impacted by our ability to heal ourselves from stress and trauma, pointing us towards trauma-informed practice. As we try to integrate mindfulness with yoga and breathing, the very essence of yoga is mindfulness. Perhaps a way to think about it is what we call the ABCs. Anchored in mindful centering, the C, connecting with mindful breathing, the B, emerging in mindful action, the A. There is a clear progression from C through B to A, not the other way around. And so that the whole practice becomes an exercise in moving meditation or mindfulness in motion. We all know what a skill is. Playing soccer is a skill. Playing a musical instrument is a skill. Coding a computer is a skill. And yet, a skill becomes a life skill when it enables us to make healthy lifestyle choices. It nudges us towards healthy behaviors. What makes a life skill transformative? When it essentially helps us develop those self-hyphenated words like self-control, like self-confidence, like self-worth, like self-awareness, like self-mastery. What we've developed is a comprehensive 48-lesson curriculum that distills the essence of an hour-long practice into 15 minutes of the ABCs, so that anyone can practice these anytime, anywhere. It's broken up into 4 units of 12 lessons each. Why did we choose 48 lessons? We figured we first needed to understand if we're going to use just a 15, 20-minute intervention, how often do you need it to have effect? And so researchers, independent researchers from UC Berkeley, from the Prevention Research Center at Penn State, they were looking at dosage. And they found, in fact, the first school that we went into with this program was about 5 years ago, where the principal and the school's health director said, we get it. We get what you're trying to do. You're preparing our students to learn. Come on in. He gave us 15 classrooms right away, over 500 students. And as we went in, we decided, okay, we're going to treat this like a lab. Some classrooms will get transformative life skills once a week, some twice a week, some thrice a week, all the way to 5 times a week. And let's see what happens. And sure enough, up to about twice a week, not significant change that was measurable. And yet, as soon as the dosage went up to thrice a week and more, we started to see a lowering of stress and an increase in emotion regulation. And so, when we designed our curriculum, we said, okay, thrice a week as a minimum, and if you take an 18-week semester and you drop off a couple weeks at the beginning and at the end, you're left with 16 weeks. And we said, all right, we have to have 3 times 16, 48. 48 lessons. And yet, 48 is also 4 times 12. And so it's broken up very systematically into 4 units of 12 lessons each. The first, stress management. You know the reason why. That's the start of the feedback loop. Next, that allows us to get to self-awareness. From self-awareness comes self-regulation, emotion regulation. And that leads us to healthy relationships. So there's a sequence, a method to the madness that is shown in this simple diagram, where TLS is at the center, and this wheel, if you will, around it, that says start with stress management. The arrows are very deliberate. You're starting with stress management, leading to self-awareness that's enabling self-regulation, that is then helping to make our relationships healthier. And you can see that as you continue with this positive feedback loop, you start to build capability in a spiral, propelling us towards greater individual and social health and systemic change. That's the essence of the idea. And so once again, the immediate findings from the early work with TLS in schools and alternative schools was that we could reduce stress, we could increase emotion regulation, which then of course impacts health, education, violence prevention. The summary of the research findings, and this is directly from Dr. Jennifer Frank, who's an educational and developmental psychologist, a research scientist. She's now research associate professor at the Prevention Research Center, working with wonderful people across the country to basically say, what's the impact? There are 3 studies that she summarized, and all of this is available on our website, just as our curriculum is. But the essence of it, and you'll have time to see all of this later, that we were able to show that TLS, these 15, 20 minutes a day, done often enough, reductions in anxiety and depression, in distress, in rumination, in intrusive thoughts, physical and emotional arousal, attitude towards hostility, revenge motivation started to change. Absences, truancy, detentions in the school started to shift. Emotion regulation, positive thinking, all of that started to pop up. And so when Jennifer called me with some of the results from these recent studies, and a couple papers are in process of getting published at this point, she said, BK, you've been talking about these 3 interconnected domains of function for quite a while. Education, healthcare, violence prevention. They're not separate silos. We're absolutely seeing that in the data. You're so excited. Look at the qualitative feedback. What are the students saying? What are the teachers saying? We're right in the field, in the front lines, just like many of you. I really like the program. It helps to calm me down, helps me refocus for class, clears my mind of distractions, helps me focus on the importance of simple things. Look how profound the implications are of this. Look at the last quote. Or the third one, for example. I really like the meditation that we do. I think that it calms me down, it focuses me, and really makes my whole day a lot better. So it's not just about the 15 minutes. The trace of the program, the trace of the effects, seem to last significantly longer. What are the teachers saying? Seeing the beneficial effects of TLS on my students. I want to bring this into my own life. Look at the next, a few down. Helped me, made me more aware of my feelings and thoughts, calmed me way down. And so, of course, just as Sonia touched upon this yesterday, that physician, heal thyself. If you have stressed out individuals around stressed out children, that's not a recipe for a solution. And so personal sustainability becomes key, and especially for those of us who are in these serving professions. How are we doing on our own stress management? Are we doing our self-care? Are we managing to heal ourselves of the secondary or vicarious trauma that we're absorbing just as definitely as we would inhale secondhand smoke if someone smoked around me? That becomes the question. If I am functioning from a non-optimal place, what is the chance for me to be in peak form as I'm trying to serve those that need me the most? And so there are 3 slides just around implications of these research findings, again, directly tied to current research. And I can just whip through these for a bit. You can get a chance to look at this later. But lower stress, what does that really mean? That high stress levels have been predicted to have an onset to depression and anxiety, common mental health disorders, to substance use, to delinquency, to disordered eating, which relates to childhood obesity, where we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and we're not able to budge the needle. Self-control, a better predictor of academic achievement with research from people like Seligman, pioneers in educational psychology. Higher school engagement. What would a teacher, what would a principal give to have that? Attitude towards violence, we talked about that. Greater emotional awareness. Tolerance to distress, what does that mean? Lower levels of depression. Hostility and revenge motivation. And fewer negative physical systems. Again, greater satisfaction with life. There's a whole bunch of impacts of these that I want you to just mull over in due course. Lower levels of rumination, intrusive thoughts. The idea that at this point with the research, we have strong inductive connections. That if indeed stress impacts emotion regulation and TLS lowers stress, then TLS must somehow relate to emotion regulation. Similarly, if emotion regulation is related to academic achievement, and TLS increases emotion regulation, then perhaps TLS is somehow related to academic achievement. And whether it's behavior in school, whether it's classroom climate, school-wide learning environment, all of that. And so we get to the power and the potential of transformative practice. It basically includes and transcends yoga and mindfulness and meditation. The idea that it's an integrative approach to the way we process information, that helps us balance, perhaps, our efforts on our internal environments with all of our efforts on our external environments. When Gandhi talked about being the change that we wish to see in the world, the operative word here isn't change. We're quick to rush to change systems, and yet we forget that individuals design systems, and ineffective individuals are going to design inefficient systems. And so the point is to embody the change that we wish to see in the world. And so that tiny word at the beginning, be, is really the key here for personal as well as societal change. That personal transformation is a necessary condition to social change. And of course, if we do this pervasively, perhaps it could be a game changer in education and healthcare and public safety and so on. And so once again, a quick little picture to get the essence of this. Our environment, the stressors in our environment, affects our brains, and our brain affects our behavior, our thoughts, our words, our actions. And so it's the gray feedback loop. Behavior then affects our environment, and if we're acting out, or people around us are acting out, how quickly the environment escalates into chaos. So we know that. And yet, the beautiful part of transformative practices is it provides yet another feedback loop within the bigger feedback loop. That behaviors aren't simply our thoughts, words, and actions. Behaviors are also practices. Practices that we can do deliberately, practices that can develop capability, develop skills that can absolutely rewire and reformulate our brains to then adapt to different behaviors. The essential principle here is the plasticity of our brains. Neuroplasticity is absolutely real. And when we say glibly that neurons, brain cells that fire together, wire together, that's absolutely measurable. And the idea that if you can do certain practices regularly, you're absolutely going to resculpt your brain, which is going to help you in this positive feedback loop that spirals you towards self-mastery. And why is this so important? People who've been studying the behaviors of highly effective people often talk about the 10-90 rule. Some of you may know of this from Stephen Covey's work and others. That about 10% of our lives is determined by what happens to us, and that 90% of our lives and more is determined by how we respond. And so this whole process around personal transformation is looking at that space between, a stimulus and a response, and of course that has hints of the possibilities once we exercise self-mastery. And so let's take a moment to look at this familiar model. All of you know it's the atom. It's been around for a few decades. You have the central nucleus, and you've got whirling electrons around it. A familiar picture. And so my question to you is, where's the power of the atom? Is it in the whirling electrons, or is it in the nucleus? This tiny little nucleus, as you know, if you smash it, it can release a tremendous amount of energy, right? Einstein's E equals mc squared. And so what does this have to do with personal transformation? Look at this little picture, very similar to the picture of the atom, where you've got the I, the sense of self, and then you've got your senses, whether it's sight or smell or hearing and so on, that's basically yanking our minds off center into engaging with the world. Much of it is essential. And yet, where is the power of the individual? It's not in our senses engaging with sense objects, perhaps, but at our core. And so as we proceed to look further at the I, let's see what happens. Neuroscientists are saying that we don't just have 5 senses, we have 2 more. The 6th is what they're calling bodily states. So just think about that. You're aware of sight and sound and touch and so on, but when you're nervous and you feel those butterflies in the tummy, that's a real feeling, and you can key into that. When you're scared and you feel your heart pounding, that's a real feeling, but they're not part of your 5 senses. And so there's something beyond that. And then let's go further. The 7th state is what they're calling mental states. Whether you're sad or you're happy, whether you're stressed or you're relaxed, whether you're anxious or you're calm. And so those are certain states of mind that you could perhaps oscillate between. What more? Let's go further in, towards the core of the I. When I say I'm sad or I'm mad, that's vastly different than saying I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling mad. In due course, you develop the capability to feel the feeling. And that is what we call the essence of self-awareness. That little separation between an overpowering emotion and the sense that it's you, the owner of that emotion, if you will. And so self-awareness becomes critical here as we try to look at who we really are. And then as you develop this capability of self-awareness, you get to self-mastery. And what is the essence of self-mastery? That you are acting rather than merely reacting. And so as we establish ourselves in self-awareness and self-mastery, we start to unleash the tremendous power and potential that is inherent in each one of us. But of course, the practice doesn't just end there. The foundational questions are, who am I, who are you, and how are we connected? And so as soon as you start to see, an I connecting with another I, essence to essence, core to core, what is it made of? I suggest that that connection can be nothing other than love and compassion, empathy and forgiveness, gratitude and service, all of this bucket of things that we often call positive emotions. It's not that it magically appears in some and not in others. These are skills that can be systematically developed to enhance it. And then the question, who are we? As you connect to a whole bunch of I's, essence to essence, and if you start to feel that full sense of interconnection and interdependence, just like the air that we share as we breathe, you start to get to an essential grand generalization that's been handed to us for thousands of years, that we're all essentially one, only appearing as many. How profound a statement that comes down to us from the ages. And so here is an example of what it did to one of those students in that alternative high school where 98% of the kids qualified to have PTSD. So it's Shelley's story. A teenager with a father in jail and a mother unavailable, engaging in all of the high-risk behaviors that you can imagine. Doing drugs, messing around in gangs, and of course she's getting D's and F's in school. In due course, she gets kicked out of the regular high school and ends up in the alternative high school, where we had a little program. And so in due course, Shelley ends up in our yoga class. And she starts to say, you know, this feels pretty good. Why don't I stop popping those ecstasy pills every day? In due course, she says, you know, I've stopped taking those ecstasy pills. Why don't I clean up my act with the other drugs that I take? Before long, she graduates out of high school, this alternative high school, and signs up for our teacher training program at the same time, saying that, you know, I'm cleaning up my act, but my friends are still in the place that I was a while back. I need to be there for them. As she was graduating out of our teacher training program, and she had already enrolled in community college, she quietly comes and tells me, BK, I got a full scholarship to go to UC Berkeley. I'm doing a junior transfer. I said, what subject? What are you going to major in? Peace and conflict studies. You know, this is someone that perhaps, you know, the world had given up on, to the point where she was starting to give up on herself, and yet the infinite potential is there. It hasn't gone anywhere. It's a question of connecting to it systematically. And you know that Shelley isn't going to rest until everyone around her is up for the challenge to change themselves systematically and build productive lives. And so, the dream for us is simple. Just as we need dosage, enough of a practice enough times, we need another part of the critical mass here to make a difference. Imagine most people in a community acting with self-awareness and self-mastery. And if we could do this practice most of the time, then we could perhaps arrive at a significant tipping point with profound implications for all of our health and well-being. And so a catalyst for self-mastery and self-awareness that helps us heal ourselves so that we can heal our communities. Imagine millions of practitioners harnessing the powers of head and heart. And we can't really do this alone. We can't do this in little pockets. We need all of our collective intelligence, a combination of our passion, our compassion, our vision, our imagination. Otherwise, how many generations of our children and our children's children are we going to throw away? And so, let us heal ourselves and heal the world around us, one breath at a time. Thank you. So, questions. And I said if you want to all kind of come in here, and I don't hear very well as I'm getting older and decrepit, so if Lindy has volunteered to articulate the questions, and the two of us will hook up on that. So, thoughts, comments, questions?
Thank you so much.
All right, Linda, help me out. Sure.
Can you hear me? Okay. Can you talk a little bit about how early this intervention can be, or is at least showing results? And then also...
Linda, come on up here and repeat the question. So,
is everyone hearing her?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't think they are. Yeah. So how early is the intervention, and what is being shown with the results?
Yes.
Yeah, how early are you seeing positive results with the intervention?
How early are you seeing positive results?
Yes, so basically this curriculum is primarily targeted at secondary schools, middle and high schools, but of course, documenting it formally, but we're also building, the primary school curriculum, which is, a natural extrapolation of this. And in India, typically these practices are brought to children, since they're 3, 4, 5 years old, and we're very much taking into elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And often the engagement is, right now, what we're proposing to schools and school districts around the country is basically think of it not as some short-term fix, but let's think about a 3-year plan where we start out by training the adults around these children first. So it's an exercise in personal sustainability as well as an ability to affect professional practice. And as these teachers are bringing this into their classrooms, we are coaching them, in addition to the trainings, thinking about a very systematic progression from first learning enough of the practice to build and sustain, develop a personal practice, and then from there to bring it into our classrooms through a second level training that allows us to demonstrate and to lead individuals and groups in it. And then the third level, which is basically to be able to train the trainer in a classic, train the trainer model. And so that's what we're doing, coupled with coaching. There's another element to this as well. Often in schools, we're picking up the youth leaders, and we're saying, let's train you in this practice so that you can be effectively, peer leaders, peer educators in these settings. So that's the kind of work that we're looking at right now.
And can you talk a little bit about the greatest challenges and pushback that you're receiving from some of the schools?
The greatest challenges you're experiencing from doing this work?
Yeah, so 2 or 3 challenges come to mind. One is initial skepticism, both from teachers and from staff, because as soon as you talk about the word yoga, there's social elitism, there's cultural incongruence, and so we have to step back to the essence of the practice, and yet we often embrace it, because the kids might say, white people do it, rich people do it, we don't do it in the hood, that kind of stuff. And I say, wait a minute, it's a universal practice. Let's get to the essence of it. If you can move, if you can breathe, you can do the practice. In fact, we're doing it without even knowing it. And so that's part of it. But also when they learn that some of the top sports stars, people that they often idolize, are actually, really practicing yoga, if they understand that, so many celebrities are doing, yoga is kind of cool too. So people are starting to, accept it a little bit. But really, the skepticism melts away when they've gotten a taste of the practice. The second challenge, perhaps, is more, institutional. Other than individual families saying whether they should or shouldn't do the practice. It's basically the challenge where in California, for example, I believe we're like number 1 in prison spending and perhaps the last in education spending. So our priorities are so messed up as a society that it's just total insanity, and we wonder why things don't change. And so how to build not only the will of the individuals, the adults around the kids that say, yes, we need this, but then also having the institutional infrastructure to support the work so that it really becomes a way to sustain it long after we've come in and done our training and coaching and so on, to really build community capacity within institutions like schools, into homes, into juvenile halls and jails. That's what we're trying to do. Yes.
I actually had a similar question to what she had, but I just wanted to clarify so that you don't have a curriculum in place for younger age students yet. Is that something we could find on your website at this time or no?
She wants to clarify that you don't have, but you do, for younger kids, the curriculum in place. You do have it.
Yes, and basically we are using, even though it's not formally written up for primary education, we've absolutely used this curriculum in elementary schools. We're doing it right now and with tremendous success. It's just that when I think of, say, the social and emotional movement inside of the US with organizations like CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social and Emotional Learning, they're fairly specific that you want a curriculum for primary education, you want a curriculum for secondary education. And so we're pulling it all together, even as we're pulling the research and the trainings all together. And the beautiful thing is, we can only do so much with direct service locally. And so we're doing that in a whole bunch of schools and alternative schools and so on in the Bay Area. But our trainings are, completely national right now, and we're starting to field international requests. But the idea is that the first level training is a day. It's like, give us 6 hours. If you don't even have a full 6 hours, we'll do it in 3 2-hour steps as parts or fractions of a minimum day or professional development. So very simply engaging the practice and then building the practice on our own to be able to teach it, to demonstrate it with some level of authenticity. Because otherwise the kids will sniff it right away. If you don't do the practice and you're asking them to do it, it doesn't work. It simply doesn't work. And so that's part of the process. But you get better each time you do it, both with self and with others. And so we're building, confidence and mastery very systematically. And then along with that, a bit of coaching and mentoring to be able to really get the individuals that are serving these children up to, the best that they can be.
Okay. And then my last question was,
yes.
Are there ways are there parts of your curriculum that allow students to continue the practice outside of the school year?
Are there parts of the curriculum that allow young people to practice outside of school time?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I say that we're serious about providing this to anyone, anytime, anywhere, so there's the curriculum. By the way, that curriculum, and I'll show you in a minute if you hang around. It's actually, the entire thing is a 440-page tome. Basically, it's available online. You can download it for free. But the point is, we're turning this curriculum, these 48 lessons, into short videos, because these are kinesthetic practices, and we're planning, we're just pulling the resources together to create a real multimedia curriculum that's available online as short videos, and then we're working with a mobile app developer to basically turn this into mobile apps, so that if anyone, anywhere, has access to the internet or has access to the cloud, they should be able to get to it at any moment. So that's what we're trying to do. Absolutely, and we've got DVDs and things like that for adults, for children and youth, in English and in Spanish and so on and so forth, trying to make this as ubiquitous as possible.
On this side?
Yes.
Hello. I'm a brain-based scientist, and our studies have shown that whether it's prayer or meditation, it creates microseizures in the mesolimbic cortex, which is not bad. Oh, sorry. Yeah. These are it creates a microseizure.
The mics have so much echo. So yeah, just come on.
We're a small enough group. So
and then Linda, you can come to the mic and then echo back the question.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. We find with meditation or prayer is that it causes microseizures in the mesolimbic cortex area. And Professor Michael Persinger from Laurentian University, with his Chilean well chamber, he actually produces these same kind of things with the transcranial stimulation of that area, which increases learning and increases IQ. And so I'm wondering, have you looked at the electronic way of increasing learning with the pulses?
Are you hearing?
I think I understood
Okay,
the
yeah.
idea that other than, say, psychometrics, are we actually looking at what's really happening in the brain and so on?
Yeah,
so actually,
and also
it's interesting.
in a sort of outside way, in a mechanical
Yes, so an objective, physical way. In addition to the psychometrics, it's interesting. A whole bunch of us speakers were in a dinner meeting that Adele had organized last night. As we're coming back from that meeting, one of the things she said is, BK, I'm really interested in looking at the impacts of transformative practices, kinesthetic and otherwise, static and dynamic mindfulness, and so, what do we need to do? Just kind of talking about early engagement and, how beautiful it would be if functional neuroimaging could be applied, right, not just in the middle of sitting meditation. And, of course, Richie Davidson and others have done quite a bit of work on that. But basically, even dynamic mindfulness. We should absolutely be able to hook ourselves up to sensors to say, as you're moving mindfully, what is the impact? And I think that would be beautiful, a nice complement to all of the psychometric work, because the teachings that have been handed out, this is time-tested stuff, right, ages ago. And so what they've been saying is that this has a very profound impact on us. All of our major systems, whether it's musculoskeletal, whether it's cardiovascular, respiratory, nervous, immune, endocrine. And so that's part of the beauty of all of this, is that to be able to find, system by system, what is the impact? You were talking about transcranial, and what does it just do to the heart? I was teaching yoga this morning, and I was saying, just breathe deeply. And you find, Herbert Benson and others at Harvard, basically saying this not only evokes the relaxation response, which helps your cardiovascular system, 15 points of a drop in systolic blood pressure in people who are hypertensives, but then they're saying something happens interestingly to your immune system. And so, killer T cells and so on and so forth. So the idea that there are many of these mechanisms we don't even quite understand, and yet they're there, and a question of documenting it.
Second question.
Yes.
We also, at the university level, we teach them cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes.
In addition. It seems to augment the process.
Absolutely.
So we teach them how to utilize their feelings.
Yes, and I think the question was, we're also teaching cognitive behavioral therapy to augment these transformative practices, and I think that makes absolutely, really good sense. This is not about some magic silver bullet that's going to change everything. The idea is, I look at it and often present it as a catalyst. Everything that you're already doing, you add this piece in, and it'll basically, make it, complement, enhance, and enable everything that you're already doing. So cognitive behavioral therapy in particular comes up really importantly when we see organizations or individuals teaching static mindfulness to students that are dealing with a lot of trauma. And what typically happens, you get them trying to sit still, and you tell them to go look inside through a body scan or whatever, and all of a sudden all the negativity comes bubbling up, and they don't know what to do with it. And so then you need psychosocial underpinnings for support. And of course, then if you add the movement piece with it, it becomes an absolutely beautiful complement. I mean, this goes back to something happened in that school that I didn't mention. Those 15 kids that we worked with. A few months later, this was a semester-long program. A few months later, the school district, the Oakland Unified School District, asked us to conduct a training, a day-long training for their staff. And so I'm walking in to start the training, and Dr. Beam, the supervisor of mental health, she was one of the participants. So she comes running up to me, BK, did you hear? I said, what, Dr. Beam? She said, every one of those 15 students graduated. And then she stopped and she said, BK, every one of them. It's like in a school where there's tremendously high dropout rates, to get that kind of a response, she was just so ecstatic. And so we're absolutely seeing this kind of thing in the field, that it is a complement. We did CBT and we did TLS as a combination. Thrice a week we did TLS, and then twice a week we did CBT, and that was a combination. And I see no conflict at all with that. In fact, it's probably extremely desirable. Yes.
How are we doing with time?
Hello.
Time? 3 more.
Okay, 3 more questions. Go for it.
Go.
Hi. Do I think it's my turn?
Okay.
Oh, I didn't know whose
Go for
turn
it.
is.
One of you.
Oh, hello.
She's been here a while.
Oh, okay.
I'm seeing both of you, so.
No worries. My name's Bonnie, and I've used a lot of these techniques as a music therapist, employing guided imagery with music, as well as doing health rhythms drumming techniques, which again shifts people into a different mindset and a mind state.
She's a music therapist and has used a lot of these techniques in both music therapy and in drawing as well.
Yes. In recreational drumming,
drumming.
in drumming, as well as in terms of doing guided imagery with music.
Yes, absolutely.
And anyway, regardless, I've done also presentations to teachers and demonstrating some of these techniques. And again, it kind of goes back to dealing with that resistance and shifting that whole collective mindset that you were referring to.
Yes.
What I'm finding is it's a matter of shifting people's belief systems, and that sometimes becomes a challenge.
Yes.
Even though some people experience the effects, there's a resistance of allowing themselves to go into that deeper state. And how are you dealing with that discomfort? And also with comments like, it seems quite spiritual or religious, and it's kind of anti to our school community or climate. How do you deal with those types of responses?
The whole issue around the resistance and how it could seem spiritual, and that whole issue. How do you get around that?
Yes. So first of all, complementing, all of this with music therapy, art therapy, all of these are complementary. They're again aiding, focus, attention, and so on. This idea of yoga being spiritual versus something that's secular. I mean, this is a challenge that mindfulness folks are also dealing with. Do you bring the Buddha into this or not? Do you think of this as, ochre-clad, bearded monks in the mountains or something, as woo-woo as possible? And I often say, look, it's not merely a physical practice. It does absolutely impact us from the inside out. And yet, there's nothing more secular than moving and breathing. And so that's how I typically present it, We don't even have to get to, philosophies and books and such. I mean, students and practitioners will pick that up when they want to, at their own pace. We don't have to thrust it down anyone's throat. And so we can start with the very concrete, and from the concrete, bit by bit, perhaps going to something more abstract.
So is that the time, or do we have?
Yeah.
Hi.
It's time.
Do I get a turn here? I think it's my turn.
Okay, one more question. Yes.
Yes.
And then catch me later. I'm here.
My name is Jerry, and I'm a neuroscientist, particularly interested in the application of
any kind of thing that results in readiness, that improves cognition, and that improves academic performance. You were talking earlier about how the waves are reduced from the extremes, which brought me to think of a whole body of research in the 70s, 80s, and 90s out of Europe. A body of research called Suggestopedia, in which they used Baroque music to teach language.
Okay. Yeah, I can definitely point you at some. Check with me right after as well if you want. But basically, a couple things that I can point you towards. One is a 2004 paper by Tangney and others. Tangney actually developed 2 versions of a self-control scale that many of us have been using since then. And so this was a 2004 paper, a landmark paper, a 52-page paper, that basically was saying that stress, chronic stress, has a massive impact on personal and interpersonal, interaction, and lays out, effect on academic potential, on substance abuse, on binge eating, on interpersonal relationships, optimal emotional responses. There's a whole psychopathology. So there's a whole bunch of things that Tangney lays out. And then a year later, Seligman published a paper that basically showed that self-control was a better predictor of academic achievement than IQ. And now, since then, 2012, there's a series of papers by Davidson, by Greenberg, and others showing the impact of mindfulness practices on the brain and how it impacts education. In fact, Richie Davidson, often says that mindfulness practices, these transformative practices, are basically to be perceived, again, this question around secularism versus spirituality, that this is mental training to prepare our children, our youth, our adults for the 21st century. And so just like you can lift weights to bulk up muscle, you need to be able to do that, for your brain as well. And so that's another way to think about this work. So thank you all. I think we're out of time. And
Okay.
yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Oh my God. You are just what a way, what a beautiful. I'm going to have to buy that. That's how strongly I felt.